This is History of the Future, a video series where I strive to build a highly detailed sci-fi fantasy universe using real-world data to create moons, planets, and star systems that are accurate to what we know to exist out in the universe, or at least get as close as possible as we can with the gaps in our knowledge that we have to work around. Okay, I think that intro is pretty concise. I'm trying to figure out an intro that isn't too long because I tend to ramble on these videos, but still explains what I'm trying to do to any newcomers. You'll all have to tell me if I succeeded in the comments or not. Today on History of the Future, we finally get to introduce a new system, the first one that we've introduced actually since the series began, and that is the Sirius Star system. The star Sirius is actually a binary star pair that is in real life a little over 8.5 light years from our solar system. The pair consists of two massive stars. A giant blue A-type star is one, and its partner is an equal mass but tiny white dwarf star. The cool thing about these white dwarf stars is that they're super old, and this means that they're in the final stages of their life. In these stages, the white dwarfs concentrate their own mass into incredibly small spaces. Sirius B, for example, has a mass twice that of our Sun, but in a diameter no bigger than the Earth. I know those sizes are a bit arbitrary to most people, but that makes these stars some of the most dense material in the entire universe, behind black holes, of course. Okay, enough about the stars here. What do we know about the planets that are in this system? Well, as it turns out, nothing. We have, as of the creation of this video, seen 0 planets in the Sirius system. So, I guess that does it for today. If you like this video and want to see more like it, then subscribe. Okay, I'm kidding. Statistically, there is probably at least 2 planets orbiting these stars. However, there are 2 reasons that I can think why we haven't seen any planets here yet. There are 3 detection methods that scientists use to find exoplanets. The first is something called direct imaging, and it's exactly what it sounds like. They take a direct picture of the planet, but the key here is that it only really works when you find super massive planets, like way bigger than Jupiter, orbiting relatively close by stars. The second is the more common method, which is the transit system. When exoplanets pass in front of stars, they block a certain amount of light. When they pass by again and again and again over the course of their orbits, we can discover all kinds of things about them, like their speed, their distance from the star, their size, etc. The catch here with this one is that the orbital plane of the star has to be in an angle where the planets that orbit the star line up with our own perfectly. Thankfully, this isn't as big of a deal as it should be, as most systems out there actually have a similar orbital plane to our own, as thankfully we follow the relative orbital plane of the galaxy, allowing us to view huge amounts of other exoplanets that fall into that category. So why not Sirius? Because simply its orbital plane must be different than ours, and also planets here must not be any bigger than Jupiter. As an important note, there is that third detection method I talked about. It's called the wobble method, and it's where a planet outside of our orbital viewing angle can be observed by the gravitational effect that this planet has on its star. But again, these planets have to be really big for that to happen, and there's no such wobble around the Sirius pair, so we can rule out those massive planets. So that narrows us down to planets smaller than Jupiter, which doesn't honestly narrow it down that much at all. So we're going to have to build out the star system on our own. Luckily for us, I've come up with a sort of rule list. It's more of a guideline list of patterns that I observe in our universe that are often exhibited in these naturally formed star systems. The first rule of building a realistic star system, of course, is to follow real-life data. If a gas giant planet orbits star A at 5 astronomical units in real life, then that's what's going to go into the system in this universe. Rule 2, for planets that we have to make up, we should generally follow true-to-life orbital and formational patterns. Okay, that is probably a pretty poor way to word it. By that I mean that multi-planet systems will often have orbits that correspond in distance to the star by the previous exoplanet's placement times 2. Here's the equation I use because I am not explaining this very well. For example, Jupiter is at 5 AU in our solar system, and Saturn is double that at about 10, and Uranus is almost 20. See what I mean now? Of course, this isn't a super hard rule, as Neptune breaks that pattern because it's at 30 AU. And a lot of the terrestrial planets don't follow this pattern at all, because this often affects larger planets far more. But it's something that we see in our own star system and many other systems out in the universe. The third guideline is when it comes to moons, the planets further from the stars will often be able to retain more moons. This rule is possibly the weakest of them all, and as you'll see, I'm going to go on to break it in this video for a very good reason. However, it's something that you'll often find, as a central star will usually steal the moons away from inner planets if they don't orbit close enough to their parents. And the outer planets will not have this problem, and will also exist in an area of these systems where there's far more space for them to capture smaller bodies in their journey across the system. 4 is an overall system setup rule. The amount of planets and asteroid belts will be influenced by the size of the stars. By this I mean giant supermassive stars, as well as multi-star systems, and tiny star systems will often signify that the orbiting system will have less planets, while medium-sized stars will often have far more. Here's my reasoning, however convoluted it may sound. Small stars suggest that the system formed in an area with very little material, and therefore there would be less material to become planets, while giant star or multi-star systems formed in an area with far more material, but the bigger or multiple stars ate up most of that material that would go on to become planets, so less planets. And finally, the medium-sized stars, similar to the Sun, would have more comparatively, as there was enough material for a larger than red dwarf star to form. However, it didn't take up all of this material, leaving more for planetary formation. It's like a Goldilocks situation. 5 is another sort of smaller rule, and that is the idea that the system's age can often be judged by the stars in the systems, and this should influence the types of planets you put there. For example, a system like Sirius would probably be a far older system, as the B star in the system is in its white dwarf phase, so at the far end of its life, but a star like Altair, that is also a giant star in its main sequence but hasn't also attracted an orbital partner, is probably far younger. Red dwarfs and medium G and F stars are a bit harder to judge with this rule, though. Guideline 6 is that each planet must have a unique environment with at least one interesting surface phenomenon, and these environments have to be scientifically plausible, so influenced by their placement in the system, the atmospheric conditions, its gravitational pull, etc. The uniqueness aspect is more of just to make these videos interesting. The final rule is another niche rule, and it applies to alien life only, so it's not really applicable to this episode, but I'll say it here so that it's established for the future. I'm going to go off the abiogenesis interpretation of life generation, which is only one of the theories out there, and I don't have a lot of time to explain it here, and I'm not an expert, so I won't try to explain it very thoroughly anyways. But for a planet to generate life of its own, it has to have a stable surface with some amount of water. It must not be bombarded with super harmful radiation, so it rarely will be orbiting a flare star, and the planet probably needs a magnetosphere, or to be the moon to a planet with a strong magnetosphere. It also needs one moon, or to be the moon to a larger planet. This will cause tides on this planet, as there is a theory that's sort of parallel to abiogenesis that says that the moon was super important for life to exist, as it created tides on Earth, which mixes up Earth's oceans. This theory is thought of because not only is Earth unique because it has life, but it's also unique because it has a really, really big moon. So that's a thought. And the final part of this rule is this planet must be in a system that is shielded in some sort of way by dangerous, like, meteor bombardments. Or by a lot of them, rather. Earth has bombardments all the time, but this usually takes the form of a large planet, like Jupiter, that exists near enough to send harmful impactors off their course to sort of protect the planet in a way. And this quote-unquote protector planet should have another nearby large gas giant to stabilize its orbit so that it doesn't migrate inward towards its star. So, like Saturn, for example. You'll often find that in real-life systems with only one gas giant will have that giant move closer to the star over the course of the system's life, as they really don't have anything stabilizing their orbits to pull them further out. Okay, that's a lot of rules, but we should be good here. Now with these rules in place, let's build our star system. So rule 1 is to follow the known data, so here are the 2 known stars, and we also know that based on their size that the habitable zone will be between 2.5 and 6 astronomical units. So any worlds relatively comfortable to humans will probably exist there. Our first planet will be a gas or ice giant, slightly smaller than Jupiter, that we'll put here at 2.5 AU. Yeah, I'm sort of breaking my own rules with the placement of a gas giant so close, but here's why that's more than possible. The stars having very little wobble suggests that there are not very many large planets in the system, so a large gas giant would most likely have no partners to stabilize its orbit, so this most likely means that it formed out in its system and migrated inward over time. It would probably have gotten quite close because, judging on the white dwarf in the system, this is a very old star system. This activity would destabilize any other planets and probably fling them all off into deep space, so there probably wouldn't be any more planets in the system, and I might do that for systems like this in the future. But since this is one of our first systems, I wanted to make it a little more interesting by adding just a few more planets that may have been influenced by their orbits changing over time. But with these planets, I used that equation I talked about earlier, the previous planet's AU times 2 equals X equation. It's not super important because these planets aren't going to be very massive, so they don't really need to be spaced out like this, but since this system's planets would be scattered about by the migration of Sirius AB1, the first planet in the system, I think large gaps sort of make a lot of sense. The second planet would be an icy Earth-sized world with rings at 6 AU. My reasoning for the rings around the planet AB2 would be that when planet AB1 passed by and threw off its orbit, planet AB2 probably had 2 moons of its own, and that these 2 moons were also thrown off in their orbits and went crashing into each other, forming the set of planetary rings. The third planet would be another one of these disturbed worlds, and it would be a smaller than Earth-sized planet at 12 AU. The final world would be a barren super-Earth that actually migrated inward from the outer reaches of the system, and it is placed at 25 AU. Now for the addition of moons, I'm sort of breaking my own rules here again, as none of the outer planets would have any moons, but AB1 would have 3. This is explained by the whole planetary migration thing, as the planet would drag the moons that it already had with it as it migrated in. But the other planets either wouldn't have moons in the case of Planet 3 or would have had them disturbed in the case of Planet 2. So now we give them all names relative to their surface features, and there we go. Here is the Sirius Star System. One more point before we get into the second part of the video, and I show you what each of these planets' surfaces would be like. Zooming out to a galactic scale, with less of a natural influence and more of a geopolitical economic influence that we have to think of. Sirius is one of the only jump points to the solar system on this side of the galaxy, so it would probably be an important system for trade due to the bottleneck of sorts that exists here. So based on how trade routes form through bottleneck regions in real life, I used this to influence this system's lore and its placement along a trade route fittingly called the Sirius Trade Route. Okay, that took way longer than I wanted it to, but at least now you have context for my reasonings behind my creative choices that I will make in the second half of this video, which starts now. Evandra, the first planet in the system, is named after a deity of travel from Critical Role, a D&D web series. But in the universe of History of the Future, Evandra is considered a real deity of an existing religion. I actually ran into an interesting little challenge when I was sizing this planet and its moons. I wanted their comparative sizes to be scientifically plausible. I wanted Moon 1 to be around 5,000 miles in diameter, Moon 2 to be around 7, very close to Earth-like in size, and the final moon, a relatively massive one, at like 8 or 9. In order to figure out how big they should be, I wanted to find a real-life ratio between a cumulative moon size and the size of the parent planet. For my first go-around, I used Jupiter and its moons for the equation and came up with the ratio 8.5. So the planet would be 8 times wider than all of the diameters of the moons in the system added up, if that makes sense. Using this equation, Evandra would be 178,500 miles in diameter. How big is that? Way too big. This would be its size compared to Jupiter, and if you remember, a requirement for the system is that planets here can't be bigger than Jupiter. On top of that, the point in which a gas giant would become a small star is somewhere around 150,000, which this hypothetical planet would blow out of the water. So I tried to reverse my process to make Evandra smaller than Jupiter and see how big I could allow myself to make its moons. And with that, I got the number that the moons altogether could be no more than 10,000 miles wide collectively. And that sort of worked for the first moon that needed to have a small size, but trying to divide up 6,000 kilometers between two moons that would be at least Earth-sized or more was just not going to be possible. At this point, I stepped back and realized that I was in a bit of a pickle, and I might have to trash one of the moons in the system to be scientifically accurate. Did I? Not quite. You see, I realized that looking at other moon-to-planet ratios, using Jupiter's ratio was far too limiting, as if I just used Earth's and the moon's ratio in the existing equation, my ratio would be 3.5, a result that is far more liberating. Using this new ratio, adding up my desired sizes gave me an Evandra that easily fit into the sub-Jupiter size category, with a diameter of 78.4 thousand miles in diameter. So that works out. I thought I hated math. I guess my high school teachers didn't make it very interesting. Anyways, moving on to the more lore-centric side of this planet, this near-Jupiter-sized gas giant would technically not be considered a gas giant. You see, gas giants and ice giants are not differentiated by their temperatures, as many people assume, but by their atmospheric compositions. Gas giants often have a higher level of hydrogen and helium than other gases, while ice giants will have more earthly gases like methane, ethane, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, or like argon. Of course, the gases that I listed aren't, the list isn't limited to that. Those are just examples. This world would be on the line between the two classifications, with some helium, water, and methane in its atmosphere, but little to no hydrogen at all. This means that this planet would not become popular for gas mining. If you remember from the previous episodes of History of the Future, a massive industry in this universe is mining hydrogen for starship fuel, and with no hydrogen here to mine, there's no hydrogen mining draw to the planet. Evandra in the early days of space exploration was considered a candidate for hydrogen mining. However, it soon became apparent that the concentration of raw hydrogen in its atmosphere was far too low to warrant the costs of running and maintaining a mine. And as more and more systems and gas giants were uncovered, the idea quickly became absurd. Today, Evandra and its system of moons are an important stop along the Sirius trade route, the most popular route for trade in all of human-inhabited space. Its second moon, Depar, maintains a strong economy and high population. It has been theorized, due to the conditions found on the other worlds of this system, that Evandra actually formed far out in the system and migrated closer into the stars over time. Evandra's first moon, Alias, and its surface features are the first of 3 examples to show how the environments on these moons might have changed when they migrated inwards towards the star. The natural environment change is, of course, the theme that all of these moons will share with each other. The landscape here was inspired by places like Mexican Hat and that one rock from Cars. And the story of how they got there would be something like this. Back when it and Evandra formed, Alias' surface was very Mars-like. It was a cold, red desert world, but as its planetary system migrated closer to the stars, this moon heated up. This would have made the atmosphere hotter and of a higher pressure, and as such, it would have experienced more extreme wind patterns. These weather anomalies would have eroded the rock over time into these bizarre towering structures, and the lower gravity than Earth on this smaller moon would have meant that they wouldn't just crumble to the ground like they would on a planet with higher gravity. In my original concept around this world, it would have been entirely uninhabited, but as I was writing the planetary info page, I thought that this planet would have definitely become a touristy spot for people who wanted to travel and see the natural wonder of the universe, as this moon looks pretty unique. So this moon would probably become the future equivalent of what is like a national park. And with that setting in mind, I imagined a very Firewatch-like setting, if anybody remembers that video game, where the only people to live on this moon would be park rangers, and it would be a really quiet and lonely job/existence in this beautiful alien environment. So I thought that was a pretty neat idea. Alias is the first moon of Evandra by distance, and its smallest moon. Studies suggest that this desert moon formed far out in its star system, and the heating of its atmosphere caused higher pressures and therefore extreme winds. These winds that whip across its surface erode the stones there over time, and due to the low gravity, towering, impossible-looking rock structures form, giving the red rocky surface of this moon an even more alien appearance. In 3002, the USSE designated a particularly beautiful and famous section of its surface a national park, as this moon, though almost not populated at all, is very popular with tourists. This next moon is the most famous part of the system, and also the most populated part of it. It originally formed as an oceanic world with a thick atmosphere to keep its ocean from entirely freezing over. As it migrated closer, it lost some of its atmosphere and its oceans evaporated away, leaving behind the deserts and salt flats and mountain ranges that were its ocean floors. This moon was originally mostly overlooked in early space travel, but as trade through the system became more and more popular, this moon, being right on the trade route and the most stable of the 4 bodies in its area, became the obvious candidate for a tourist and travel-centric economy. Its main starports, Oasis, Jameson, and New Dubai, would be the largest and most popular cities on the planet. Oasis being the biggest by population and building count, but New Dubai being, for obvious reasons judging based on the name, the more famous city on the planet. These cities are placed on or near mountain ranges, as these would be the easiest and most stable to build on. This planet really is not super valuable on its own, but purely for its place in trade has one of the most booming economies and flamboyant cultures in all of the USSE. Basically think space Las Vegas. The orbital spaceport above the moon, though a little more business-focused, is the largest in the system and has many flashy attractions for travelers. The spaceport is the Sirius Interstellar Orbital Trade Port, more commonly called the SIO port. The second moon of Evandra, aka Depar, is a highly populated and travel-popular world at the Earth-side end of the Sirius trade route. The deserts, salt flats, and towering cliff structures, along with the unbreathable but Earth-similar atmosphere on this planet, suggests that a worldwide ocean once covered this moon. Its placement along the trade route makes this touristy planet one of the most economically wealthy in the USSE. It is famous for its luxury hotels and casinos. Every 912 days, the salt flats flood in one night, evaporating the next day. This local holiday is called Cozy Day. Cozy, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing right, is Japanese for flood. The final of Evandra's moons is Ishu, named after a trickster god from a Nigerian religion. I named it after a trickster god as it may look pretty from afar with its white cloud tops shielding its surface, but below these superheated thunderstorms is a boiling ocean of water. It's not a very pleasant place to be. It was believed to have started out as an icy moon like Europa, but as it was heated and the ice evaporated into dense cloud cover, it heated up this super Earth-sized moon. This moon and its dangerous conditions really should find itself on the NLZ list, but it doesn't. If you remember from the other videos, the NLZ list is a list of legally recognized planets formed by the USSE Senate, and it comprises a list of these planets that are too dangerous to land on, and therefore it is legal for salvage and rescue companies to send their employees to these worlds to rescue people or ships. Because, well, it's just too hazardous. Ishu really should be on that list, but I wanted to begin to establish how certain parts of the USSE's government may be ineffective, as realistic governments would be, and as the gridlock/politically motivated decisions would probably lead to controversial calls by the Senate, which is obviously something that we see in real life all the time. We'll have more on that in a few planets down the line, but for now, Ishu is theorized to have formed as an icy moon alongside its parent planet Evandra. When it migrated closer to the system's stars, the raising temperature and higher levels of greenhouse gases that escaped from the ice caused the thick atmosphere and worldwide oceans to form. The violent and turbulent oceans and churning superheated thunderstorms have warranted this moon being taken on and off the USSE's NLZ list over and over again during the past several hundred years since its discovery. Currently, this world does not find itself on the list. Finally, moving on to the outer planets in the system, Borius, named after a god of the north winds, would find itself on the far edge of the habitable zone, and therefore inhabited. Though it is found along the same trade route as Depar, and relatively close by, these worlds would have very different feels. The colder temperatures would make this world far less of a party scene, and more of a no-frills, simple business port, popular with people who travel as their career rather than for fun, making this world basically a space truck stop. That heavily simplifies what this world is like, though. Borius's rings make it a beautiful place, especially at night, and they'd be visible on most populated points on the planet. The cities here, like most populated planets, would be interconnected by a set of monorail high-speed trains. And like the city that it belongs to, the spaceport at Point Izaz would be a no-frills landing zone with simple, cheap, and warm hotels to accommodate travelers wishing to stay. Although many people flying through will simply elect to stay at the orbital spaceport above the world, because it's easier to get clearance to land at a space station than it is to land on a planet. My final drawing here illustrates how I imagine flying over the landing zone at Point Izaz might look like during the day. Borius is the second most populated body in the Sirius Star system, and a very important point along the Sirius trade route. Though it is often overshadowed by Depar, in the eyes of tourists, the beautiful rings and vast glacier fields make this planet a beautiful place to visit. The rings of Borius at night light up the ground brighter than Earth's moon lights up the night on Earth. It is said to be one of the most beautiful sights in all of the USSE. The third planet in the system would be a highly interesting one. During production, I called it Cryogen, which is supposed to allude to the geological activities that take place on its surface, but I felt like that didn't fit in with the established names. I also just didn't like it, so I thought of simplifying the word and naming it after an in-universe scientist who maybe landed on it for the first time. So, Crin's planet, or Crin for short, has a highly unique surface, although it may not look it at first glance. Flying through its gray carbon dioxide skies, the yellowish surface wouldn't look super interesting until you flew down into one of the mile-wide and multi-mile deep sinkholes that lead into the snaking cave systems that form interconnected tunnels under the crust of this planet. This world was once the closest to its star in the system before it was kicked out of its orbit by Evandra, and back then it had a limestone-rich surface covered in oceans of water. This water eventually eroded many parts of the porous limestone rock, forming these spiraling mile-wide tunnels. As the planet got further and further from the stars, the water froze, killing the planet's geological activities. And under the limestone swaths along its surface, there became tunnels with floors of frozen ice, quite literally frozen in time. This planet finds itself on the USSE's NLZ list, and that standing is highly controversial. The ruling most likely comes from a blatant misunderstanding of the planet's surface, as the government's reasoning cites that the surface is unstable. And although the limestone swaths can be unstable, even though they aren't really anymore with the water being frozen, and also the massive multi-mile high glaciers that carve across the mountain's surface, the frozen oceans and vast deserts are very stable places on this planet, and these can make for equally stable landing zones. There is a petition to remove this planet from the list so that it can become a national park like Alias. However, this has not amounted to anything as of 3023. The surface of this world has been controversially categorized amongst the worlds in the NLZ list. There is a popular petition to take Crin's planet off that list in order to make the beautiful massive sinkholes that can be found in the limestone swaths across its equator a natural preservation park. The danger associated with an NLZ makes most organizations not want to set one up, even on the more stable parts of the surface like the polar sand deserts. The famous Sinkhole Orbital Research Institute orbits this planet and is a giant university/space station, studying the frozen and geologically dead sinkholes from afar. Thol is the final planet in the system, and as you might be able to tell if you're a space nerd like me, the planet Thol is named after Tholin. Tholins are a red dust material that forms on extremely cold planets in our own solar system. I'm honestly unsure if I even put this planet far enough from its star, as although in our own solar system Tholin begins to form before 10 AU, and this planet is at about 25. You got to remember that the stars in the system burn way hotter than our own, so I may have put this one right on the line or even over it. In a more lore-focused point, the vast super-Earth is both far out of the way of any trade routes and just uncomfortable to exist on because of the high gravity. However, this remote location does make a very good spot for a certain kind of less than legal trade. So smugglers often find themselves making deals out on the red plains of Thol. Thol is named after the dusty material that gives its icy surface a blood-red tinge from afar. It is believed by scientists that this planet formed further out in the star system and was disturbed by the movements of Evandra and the other planets into its current orbital distance. As many scientists say that Tholin is unlikely to form on planets under the conditions that Thol finds itself in. Thol's remote location made it a prime meeting location for illegal trade deals and smuggler handoffs in the early days of space travel. But in the recent decades, this activity has become more and more risky as local law enforcement has made patrolling Thol's airspace a top priority. So, that's all for the planets of this system, but there are a few more inhabited points beyond the planets out near the jump gates of the system. With the 4 gates in this system, it is a heavily trafficked center point for not only the Sirius trade route, but a route called the Toucan Cloudbound Run and the route towards Tau Ceti, one of the most populated systems in the entire universe. So there, in a nutshell, is the Sirius Star system, a center point for earthbound trade for the entire southwest portion of the galaxy. I hope you all enjoyed this episode of History of the Future. I'm still figuring out the best way to structure these episodes to make them, of course, entertaining, but also to keep them short and concise while still getting out all the ideas that I need to at the same time. I'm going to do a few more star systems in the coming months. My plan is to go over each system in order from distance to Earth up to Tau Ceti. Then I'll probably start fleshing out the future Earth and the quote-unquote homeworlds of humanity, as I originally planned to do earlier on, but I soon realized that it was a video that was just going to take way longer to be out. I maybe should divide it up. I just needed to think about it for more time, so I'm not doing that until later. But for now, that's going to be it for this video. Next time, I will be visiting the nearby star system of Epsilon Irideni, the home of the extinct Ran civilization. I hope you're all as excited for this as I am. But for now, that'll do it. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and if you did, and want to see more like it, then subscribe, and turn on the bell to get notified when I upload next.